Great. So we'll take it from the top, but again, this is the very abridged version of this presentation for folks in the design group that already have all of the context and for which none of this should be new information. But in this presentation, we're going to be talking about why the Impact Conveners Trust. So what's the opportunity here for the ecosystem, how the trust works, how organizations can become part of the trust, and next steps for exploring trust membership. So why the trust? Just to recap again, individually, there's an opportunity in becoming part of this type of a steward-owned entity to become community-owned, to share proceeds and control with your communities, and to protect your mission over the long term. And as a collective of organizations, we're also exploring the Impact Conveners ecosystem as a way to share services and deepen partnership. So this is the goal we've been exploring, both mission protection and operational collaboration between all of our convening organizations. And the vision is this broader Impact Conveners ecosystem with the trust on the top, focused on mission protection, community benefit, and co-governance. And then also this affiliated, potentially subsidiary shared services organization, which would help with things like shared HR, pooling, marketing, ops, sharing incentives, and be something like a low profit member co-op. But that was not the focus of this design process. It's a parallel exploration. And so that's what we'll be exploring today. And again, a lot of the goals we've already talked about as part of the trust are mentioned here on slide 8. So how the trust works. I'm not going to go through any of this recap right now because we're with the high context group, but we talk about what steward ownership is, how perpetual purpose trust works, and then the basic structure of the Impact Conveners Trust. And so this is really a summary, y'all, of what we've decided in our design group, where each member organization in the trust will have one operating board member appointed by the Trust Stewardship Committee. And in turn, each of those member organizations will nominate one trustee to the co-stewardship group in the Conveners Trust on the Trust Committee. And so each individual organization's management will be independent and operationally on their own for the most part, but ultimately they're going to be responsible at least on some level to high-level mission oversight by the Trust Stewardship Committee through this and sort of mutual accountability through this this lock-in structure. And this structure will work for one organization to really, X number of organizations. It's a highly flexible structure. Hey, Chris. So just for a bit of context, what we're doing is we're running through a super abridged version of a presentation that was intended for a larger group, which really summarizes the outcomes of our design group process. And so we're just kind of flying through it now, recording it to see if it's useful to anyone, and then we're gonna schedule a longer version of this meeting for probably a month from now, so that more folks that are less initiated to what we've been working on can ask us questions and actually dig in. So we're not going to talk here about the differences between the Trust Stewardship Committee and the Operating Board, but that's summarized on slide 13. Here's a summary of the Trust Stewardship Committee design that we all came up with. So on the left, the summary of the committee seats that we talked about, and initial committee members being the first generation of member orgs. And then on the right-hand side, some of the TBD evolutionary questions around independent seats in addition to those member orgs, and that'll be determined by the first Trust Stewardship Committee. Then on slide 15, I summarized our purpose statement that we all wrote together. That's on slides 15 and 16. And again, this is sort of intended as a canonical document here and table of contents. So the cleaned up versions of all of our working documents from the design process are linked on the relevant slides and at the end. Also a summary of the governance process. So just very briefly, not going into the voting procedures for the Trust Stewardship Committee, but just talking about how voting procedures work for the Trust Stewardship Committee and how the trust enforcer kind of provides that independent oversight and arbitration on major decisions, and can be approached with grievances if any community member in the ecosystem thinks that the trust is not upholding the purpose that we've co-developed. Governance is going to evolve over time, and as we've all talked about a lot, we're leaving space for that in the design docs. So part 3 of this is how organizations become part of the trust. So, and this is actually where I think there's a lot of room for ongoing visioning and sort of brand discussion. So how do we want to talk about the majority versus minority owned members of the trust, and sort of what's the pitch to each of those? What's the ask and give for different types of members? And on the left-hand side, we've got the full community-owned and governed majority trust-owned member, and sort of a summary of what it looks and feels like to be an organization that is finding its final purpose-protecting home in this community-owned vehicle. And then on the right, the requirements and details around what it would be to be a minority member, and how this gives a path to collaboration and community co-governance without precluding future M&A, but also sets companies up for a future mission-driven exit into the trust if that's something they're interested in. I summarized our membership requirements here. So in the full membership requirements that are linked here, I've highlighted in red all the areas where we still haven't made final determinations. And maybe I was saying this before everyone was on the call, but there's areas here where I think just realistically, the membership requirements are going to be very easy when we know which organizations want to, at the outset, hand raise as trust members, because things like how are we going to divide the costs of operating a trust, which is $10,000–$15,000 a year in total, and how often do we want to report to the trust? That becomes a very easy. It's a hard conversation in the abstract. It becomes a very easy conversation between the leaders of 2 or 3 convenings. So this is slide 22 is what we talked about in all of our one-on-ones, and is sort of a summary of the main paths for donating or selling an organization into the trust, whether it's majority or minority. It doesn't really matter. This is just the paths for getting shares, some amount of voting shares into the trust. And I'm not going to go through these because we've talked about them all one-on-one, but basically donation, trust buyout, and seller financing are the 3 core mechanisms. And then we can do hybrid combinations of all of those. We can also do fancier procedures like splitting voting and economic shares. And this is really a case-by-case decision for organizations based on the needs of their owners and the tax implications. And again, it's relatively hard to talk about in the abstract. So what we've done is, with encouragement from the relevant leaders here, we've just summarized at a high level the path for OC, hypothetically, to use seller financing as a path into the trust, and the path for UCOT to use a trust buyout as a path to trust ownership. And then as well an example of a hypothetical minority trust member that maybe is selling or rather buying back a small number of existing equity as part of a growth raise and settling that equity into the trust so that they can be a minority trust member. And that would be like a donation growth capital raise hybrid type of approach. So just to show really these run the gamut, and what it's going to come down to is what we have on slide 26, which is really the questions we went through with everyone here one-on-one, which is, why do you want to go into the trust in the first place? So what's your motivation, and what is the feasibility in terms of an ownership and leadership transition into this type of a stewardship model? And I think that probably we'll just get to the end of the presentation in case we want to cut off a recording, but this is where we could come back to and spend a few minutes discussing in this meeting because I think it's relevant in terms of thinking about who else we invite into the next set of conversations. So suggested next steps, final section here. Again, this is in some ways we've made a ton of progress. It will remain a somewhat open-ended process until one or more entities decide, all right, it's time, we're gonna do this, and we're ready to resource it and sign the legal documents and make this thing happen. But a quick summary of where we are and where we think we should go next. There's this parallel process of determining the role of the shared services organization. And we've heard from a lot of groups and leaders that this is sort of a core motivation for becoming part of the ecosystem. And so it might be worth actually running this down before we paper the trust and determine whether we want to set up the shared services, at least a shell for the shared services entity as part of the initial trust ecosystem, and or write some MOUs with initial member organizations to actually, provide the backing for setting that thing up. Optional. Then as far as trust setup and legal implementation, it's really making those final decisions, probably among the group of interested convenings, and finalizing the design documents, and then retaining a law firm to paper them, and that'll be relatively, ready to go from our legal handoff documents, and also something that we can be on call to support with the transition and finding the right legal firm to do it. And then finally, there's this big, I think, opportunity really around building and extending the shared vision, the brand, and the pitch to others to join the convening ecosystem. And so that's kind of probably double clicking in a little bit more on the final membership requirements, the offerings, not just the requirements, but the benefits of membership and any associated documentation. And then, maybe it's an open call for membership. Maybe it's just a little bit more of a targeted pitch to a couple of folks that have been sort of circling, but feels like there's a really exciting opportunity to make this real for people and get a few organizations at once to make a splash by doing this together and pioneering this new community ownership entity. So, and then in backup here, we have just a table of contents. These are our core. It looks really sad given the amount of time we spent. These are meaty documents: our purpose statement, our membership requirements, and our trust governance docs. About a dozen pages of quasi legalese that we fought through together valiantly. And then here's an annotated version. I shared a version of this earlier with the design group, but this is kind of an annotated version of that simpler diagram I showed earlier, basically showing what the full ecosystem looks like and what each of the pieces does. And so this actually could be an easy reference point for someone that wants to get the full picture all at once. So I think with that, Topher, I'll ask you to direct us a little bit here, but I think really the two places I could see spending a little time today are just talking about making sure we're all aligned on both the sense of, you know, justice that we've done in summarizing everything in this presentation, and then our next steps as a group, and how we want to think about engaging or mobilizing either ourselves or others around these next steps.
And before anything else, how about a round of applause for our dear friend Matt?
I don't even
Good
know
job,
if
Matt.
I don't even
Way
know
to
if
go,
anyone's
Matt.
here.
Yeah, you did it. That's great.
How many minutes was that?
Let's see. I don't know. I'm gonna stop recording. It'll tell me.
I'm sick too.